All right, well, we are back. An eventful day yesterday. We didn't really have a chance to get on here and look at the scriptures. There's a lot going on today, too, but we're going to go ahead and focus on this. Focusing on what God says and looking at what God says is important. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to pick up where we kind of left off in Job chapter 11. We're going to look at chapter 10. Job chapter 10 through 16. And Stephen, you're here with me today, and we're going to look at the text and see what's going on. All right?
Yes, sir.
All right, so what were your kind of takeaways when you read through those? It's actually 7 chapters total, but how did you feel about those chapters?
How did I feel?
Yeah, like what was your, when you read through them, what was kind of the overall tone, the takeaway? Like,
Job thinks that if he could just talk to God, he could convince him that he didn't do anything worthy of how he's being treated. And his friends are convinced that Job's sins deserve even more than what he's getting.
Yeah, so is it a hopeful passage? Like you read through it and at the end you're like, oh, this is great, I feel good. How does it make you feel?
Nervous.
Nervous? Nervous is a good answer. Foreboding. Hopeless. Like it makes me, when I read through it, just seeing how everyone is approaching God, how Job thinks of God, how his friends think about God, it makes me think that if they're right, regardless of who is right, if the friends are right, then the only people who have any hope are the ones who do everything correct. And interestingly enough, in the reading today, Eliphaz is actually going to say nobody does the right things. Well, I mean, if that's true, then there's no hope. If only people who do what is right have hope, but nobody does what is right, then there's no hope. If Job is right, then whether he does good or evil, he has a terrible life, and so there's no hope there either. Right? In fact, Job is arguing that God is unjust, or that there is injustice on God's part. And that's the worst thing, right? And it's because Job doesn't understand what's going on, and his friends don't understand what's going on. And so what we have to be careful when we look at the situation is sometimes when we don't have all of the information, we come to faulty conclusions. And when we're dealing with God, those faulty conclusions escalate, right? They kind of mushroom out, and they become even bigger and bigger issues than they were, because you started off with this one little thing that you didn't understand correctly. And in this case, one of the major things is that God only does good things, or God does everything, and God only punishes people who are sinners. So you take that misunderstanding, and then you begin looking at life, and all of a sudden, the applications that you make, it expands. It becomes a much larger problem than just this one little nugget of truth that you've got wrong, right? Because it's a foundational truth. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right, so let's dig into the text, dive into the text. We're not going to really dig into it, but we're gonna try and cover these 7 chapters pretty quickly. All right, so like you said, verses 1 through 7 in Job chapter 10, Job is saying, hey, I didn't do anything wrong. I will say to God, do not condemn me. Let me know why you're contending against me. Right? So he doesn't feel like he's done anything wrong. And the friends, like you mentioned, are going to react negatively to that. So then verses 8 through 12, Job recognizes God made him, and then in the rest of the chapter, he's like, not only did God made me, but now he's unmaking me. He built me up. One of my favorite things that he'll say is, God formed me out of cheese, or formed me like cheese. We don't often think of ourselves like that. But if you think of like the forming of the man from the dirt, it's kind of what you do with cheese. You take it and you press it, and anyway, you can make it into any shape you want. That's funny. You formed me like cheese. And now he's being devoured. And so God not only made the cheese, but now God is eating the cheese, and Job, the cheese, is upset that he's being eaten. And we shouldn't, it's a funny picture when you think about it, but he's expressing himself in ways that make sense to people back then. Right? If you had animals, you made cheese, and you knew what it was to take the milk and curdle it and press it and form it and do all of that. And so he's saying, this is what God has done. God made me, but now he's destroying me for no purpose. You wouldn't make a wheel of cheese and then just go throw it off of a cliff, right? Why would you put all the work into it? And so in Job's mind, it doesn't make sense. And he's even going to say, we've already passed the beginning, but he's even going to say, is God like a man? Does he look at things the way people look at things in verse 4? Does he have eyes of flesh? And so there's this question, why is God behaving like people? And we can see people who don't do the right thing, right? We can see people who punish those who do what is right. They laud or they magnify people who do what is wrong. And God isn't supposed to be that way. And so Job is struggling. Why is God behaving like everybody else if God is supposed to be this different holy being, but he's acting just like people do? So you can kind of understand where he's coming from, his stress or his distress. In fact, at the end of chapter 10, Job is going to say, just leave me alone, right? Verses 18 through 22. It's kind of, God, just leave me alone. If this is how you act when you're dealing with me, then stop dealing with me. And that is a common sentiment when people think that God has wronged them in some way. I mean, you don't like to hang out with people who beat you up all the time, right?
No.
I mean, you wouldn't if that happened. You don't like, people tend not to want their friends to be very critical of them all the time. And so you can understand why Job is saying, God, if this is the kind of friend you are, just don't be my friend. And that's a sad place to be. Any other comments about that, chapter 10?
No, not really.
All right, let's press on. Chapter 11. So who's going to be talking now?
Zophar.
Zophar. Oops.
The Naamathite.
Let me get us to the right place. Zophar, the Naamathite. Cool name, Zophar. Yeah, but he's wrong. And kind of what you said, his friends are going to come and say, you deserve worse than you're getting, actually, Job. Lesson for you, a life lesson. When somebody is going through a time of difficulty, do not try and comfort them by saying, you deserve way worse than you're getting. Right? If somebody goes to the doctor and the doctor gives them bad news, you have a sickness, or you have a short time left to live, don't tell them, well, I mean, you should have died years ago. That's not comforting. And sometimes we say silly things when we're trying to comfort people. Mm. Like when my dad was killed, a younger person, and it tends to be younger people who do this, but not always. A younger person came up to me and said, oh, I know just how you feel. My dog died a few months ago. And it's like, wait a minute, my dad just died. And you're telling me that your dog died and you know exactly how I feel.
I don't think that quite makes sense.
Yeah, goofy. But I knew that they meant well. I knew they meant well. But don't do that, right? Don't ever compare a pet to like somebody's parent or their wife or their child. Just don't do that.
That's not a compliment.
Right. Well, you felt sad when your dog died, but it's different, right? And don't say when somebody is suffering, don't come to them and say, I know just how you feel, because you don't, right? You don't know how they feel. Even if you've been through a very similar situation, you still don't know how they feel. And so if you're coming and you're trying to comfort somebody, then just focus on comforting them. Don't make it about you. Like when you say, oh, I know how you feel, that's about you, right? Don't make it about you. Let it be about them and say, I'm sorry that you feel lost. I'm sorry that you're sad. I'm sorry this has happened to you. And what can I do to help you? If it's just sit here, the best thing the friends did is sit with Job. That's great. If you don't know what to say, then don't say anything. Just go be with somebody. Make them food. Do their laundry, right? Do something to help comfort somebody, make their life better or easier. But here Zophar comes and says, Job, you're evil, and God should have done worse to you. And Job had 10 children, and his children have just died. He's lost all of his possessions, thousands of animals. He's lost all of his servants, his friends. His wife doesn't like him anymore because she thinks that all of this has happened because of him. And so it's to tell him that, man, you deserve worse than this. Talk about et tu, Brute, right? Okay, chapter 11. What do you think what did you think when you read through chapter 11? Anything stand out to you in particular?
No, but I was thinking about kind of what you said. I was just, when Zophar says that, I was almost thinking, can it even get worse for Job?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, not only did he lose all his things, like we talked about, but he's lost his health too, right? He's in terrible physical condition. I don't know how it could get worse. In fact, Job is begging for death through all of his speeches. Job, that's a consistent theme. Not only is Job begging for death, Job is saying, it would be better if I had never been born. So Job, in Job's mind, it can't get worse. Death makes it better. And in the biblical text, death is a bad thing, right? Death is the weapon of the enemy, which Christians do not have to be afraid of anymore. But we're not there yet in the biblical narrative, right? As the story is being unfolded in front of us, death is very fresh. It's in Genesis. It comes as a punishment for sin. And so Job, to welcome death, is to say, the worst thing is better than what has happened to me. So yeah, you're right. It couldn't get worse in his eyes. Okay, so Zophar is like, you think you're clean, Job. You think you say my doctrine is pure in my eyes in verse 4. But oh, that God would speak to you and open his lips and let you know just how wrong you are. All right, that's kind of what Zophar is saying. He's going to finish up his speech in verses 13 through 20 by saying, if you would just repent, then God would relent and make everything back to the way it was. That's not comforting either, because sometimes bad things happen and we don't know why. Telling somebody that, oh, God did this to you because you're a bad person, and God will make it right if you'll just stop being a bad person. That's not comforting either, especially because Job doesn't understand what he's done wrong. Just throwing accusations at people isn't helpful. And so when we truly have somebody else's best interest at heart, what should we do?
We should try and help them.
Yeah, encourage them, right? Give them ways that they can improve. Like instead of just saying, Job, you're evil, you need to be not evil. Say, well, Job, let's do this to begin working towards something better. Right? So if you're going to help somebody, actually help somebody. Don't just tell them they're terrible.
Zophar seems to be basing his statements on the premise that bad things only happen if you've offended God or done something wrong.
Yeah, and is that true?
No.
Yeah, who do bad things happen to?
Everybody.
Everybody. In fact, bad things happen to the best buddy. Right? Body. To Jesus. Right, his whole life, people stood opposed to him. His family didn't like him. His disciples couldn't understand him. People were trying to kill him. They were trying to get him thrown out of the synagogue. I mean, everything they could think of to do, even to the point eventually where they're trying to have him executed by the Romans, and they eventually do. He is nailed to the cross. That's bad, right? All those things are bad, but Jesus definitely has done nothing to deserve it. So bad things happen to people who've done the right thing.
And then he, continuing in that same train of thought, he thinks that good things happen if you are doing what's right. But that's not always necessarily true as well.
Right. So the basis for your decision, the basis for how you determine righteousness becomes a success. Right? Whoever is successful is the person who is righteous. And we have to be very careful that we don't fall into that same trap. We tend, the American attitude, which isn't necessarily wrong, just from a general perspective of life, in that you need to try and be the best you can be, right? We allow that attitude to come into our spiritual life, where we begin to say, oh, well, the people who are successful are the people who are doing what they need to be doing. And unfortunately, it doesn't work that way in culture or in theology, right? In our dealings either with our society or our dealings with God. The fact that you try and do everything God wants you to do doesn't mean that your life is going to go right. The fact that you wake up every day and work hard and do your best doesn't mean that you're going to be successful in business. It just doesn't work that way. And there are myriad examples that we could look to. And so you're right. It's a flawed reason. And so what you wind up with is this thinking is very pervasive, even into the New Testament time, where you see Jesus dealing with people like the Pharisees or the scribes, the lawyers, and they equate health and success with righteousness. Right, the blind man in John chapter 9, the question is, who sinned, that guy or his parents? because he's blind. Clearly somebody sinned. Well, no, sometimes that's not why things happen.
So is this a recurring theme throughout the narrative of the scriptures?
Yes. It shows up a lot in the Bible. It shows up in human experience, right? We tend to think that if somebody is successful, they must have done something right.
It's a very appealing idea. It makes sense.
Especially
it seems to
if
make sense.
It's appealing if
you're doing well.
If you're successful, right? Because now not only do I have everything I want, but that is an indicator that God loves me. Well, it's interesting that all throughout the prophets and Jesus, he's continually talking about the poor and the oppressed and lifting them up. God cares about them. He cares about people who are not kings. He cares about the people who society views as outcasts. James will say that caring for widows and orphans is pure and undefiled religion, right? And so the focus throughout the Bible is justice. And biblical justice, while it includes, if you break the law, you get punished, right? It includes that, but it is even more than that. It is lifting somebody up. It is elevating them, bringing them out of a low status into a high status, recognizing in each person the image of God, even in somebody who breaks the law. That was one of the interesting things about the law of Moses, is it actually defends the lawbreaker, right? It doesn't see them as less than human. And so that's important. This idea of God only loves the wealthy and the politically successful or socially successful, that is a theme that is all throughout human history. And it's just not, it isn't a biblical truth. Okay? Yeah, so that's kind of Zophar chapter 11. All right, chapter 12. What's going on there?
Well, the heading says that Job says the Lord has done this.
Mm-hmm. Which is right or wrong?
It's kind of accurate.
What do you mean, kind of?
Well, I mean, the heading is... Are you talking about what the heading says?
Did God do this to Job?
No.
Right. Did he allow it? Yes.
Well, yes.
Yes. Right. All things that come to pass have been allowed by God. And so, like we talked about at the very beginning, one of the questions that Job forces us to ask is, why does God allow things? But an idea that must be corrected is the idea that God does everything. There's a very big difference between allowing and doing. Right? Our government allows, right, the state of Tennessee allows you to drive a motor vehicle, knowing that full well that any individual might violate the laws of the road and cause an accident, and people or property could be damaged. Did they do that?
No.
No, but did they allow somebody to drive that might cause potential issue? Yes. Right. So here you have God allowing an adversary to stand opposed to Job, to hurt him and to harm him. And that's very different than God doing it. It still raises a lot of important theological questions, but it's a different question. And now humans, when bad things happen to us, one of the things we always say is, why did who do this to me?
God.
Why did God do this to me? And he didn't necessarily. I mean, maybe he did, right? I don't know. I don't know everything. But I do know that there are very powerful spiritual beings who are living and active and interacting with the physical world besides God, right? There's Satan and all of his angels. Jesus talks about them in Matthew 25. And you can see them very active throughout all of the Old Testament and the New Testament. I mean, you see these things. And so they are interacting, and they're hurting and harming and helping people that they choose. Right? And there may be times where God stops that, but there's also times where it's allowed. And so here in Job, it's not God who's done anything to Job. In fact, God is the one who had the hedge around Job, protecting him. And now that hedge has been taken down, and Satan is the one, or the Satan, the adversary, is the one who is attacking and harming Job. Right? So Job is wrong. Right? Yeah, he does say, God did this to me. But he's not right.
And in the second part of the chapter, like, I know that's kind of like what it says the chapter's about, but that's mostly just like the first half. Mm-hmm. In the second half, he's talking about how God's so strong that no one, Like he's too powerful. There's no one who can stand up and help Job or like do anything to defend him or alleviate the damage.
Yeah, is that starting verse 7? Where is that? You're right. That's what it is. I'm looking for a. Oh, here we go. Yeah, in verse 13, if God with God or wisdom and might,
Yeah.
if he tears down, no one can rebuild. What he shuts, no one can open. Yeah, and so there's this recognition that God ultimately is sovereign, and he's right. God is sovereign, but where he's wrong is that God isn't the one who has done this to him.
And then he says further on in like verse 17 to like 25, so I guess to the end of the chapter, he's talking about how even the mightiest or the greatest, the wisest people cannot stand against him. So I guess kind of making by comparison, how could I even hope to try?
Right. There's no hope. Yeah, you're right. So chapter 13 is going to kind of continue on in that same vein. Job is arguing that he has wisdom too. You know, Zophar has said, well, you're foolish. You just need to listen to my wisdom. And Job is saying, well, first of all, you're assuming that you have wisdom and I don't. And second of all, you're assuming that you have come to the correct conclusion and I haven't. Right? And we often do that when we disagree with people. We're like, if you would just listen to me, you would understand everything. And very often there are at least 12 sides to the coin, right? And so you have to pay attention and listen to more than just your perspective. If you limit your exposure to truth to what you already think is true, you will never grow as a person. And that's true for everything. If doctors did that, they would never learn new techniques. If artists did that, they would never learn how to do new things. If we do that as disciples, then we will never grow spiritually beyond our own physical, mental limitations. Right? And so that's an interesting discussion there. Chapter 14, Job is still talking, right? He's still replying to Zophar. And now Job is saying, life is short. And so what is happening to me just kind of helps me realize that my situation is hopeless. Not only is life short, but my life is terrible, is kind of what Job is saying. Right? So if life was really long, it would have meaning. But life is short, and so it seems less meaningful. And it's full of trouble, which makes it even less meaningful. And so Job is kind of saying, what is the purpose of life? What's the point? I have no idea why I'm even here, is maybe a way that we would word that. It's a great question. So in verse 14 of chapter 14, he's going to ask this question. Let's see if we can get there. If a man dies, will he live again? Why is that an important question?
Because ultimately the answer is yes.
Right. And if the answer is yes, does life become important?
Yes.
Yeah. If it's one and done, right, if you're born, even if you live 70 years, if you're born and you live 70, 80 years, and then you die, that's a blink in the span of time, right? It's not very long. That means that would make your life pretty insignificant. But if you're going to live again, then who you are and what you do all of a sudden has a little bit more meaning. And so what Job is doing is he seems to be grappling with what is the meaning of my life. And the answer to that question, like you're saying, ultimately will be yes. Yes, there is a life after death. And he looks through and he sees other things that live. You cut a tree down, it can sprout back. But if you cut a man down, he stays dead. So a tree has more meaning than a human. Right? It's kind of the idea. It's the picture that you're getting in the discussion here. And that makes it difficult when you're faced with adversity. What's the point of suffering through the adversity? And that's why Job will say it's just better to die. Okay, so chapter 15. Let's get there.
I had one note about chapter 14.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, man.
There was one verse that I kind of liked. It was just kind of funny. He says, where is it? In verse 6, he says, look away from him and leave him alone that he may enjoy like a hired hand his day. He's kind of talking about just give me a weekend.
Yeah.
Is how you might say it.
Yeah. Yeah, I just need my time off. Yeah. All right, so then Eliphaz talks, our good friend Eliphaz, who God calls out at the end of the book and says, "You have not spoken correctly concerning me." So one of the things to do when you're reading through Job, it's really important. People throughout history, John Calvin and others, have come to Job to prove things using the speeches of the friends. Because the speeches of the friends are going to say certain things like, if you do what's right, God will always bless you. Or humans are terrible and they always do bad things. And they're going to quote from the friends. That's important because when you get to the end of the book, God says, Eliphaz and all of the friends, you guys are totally wrong. All right, so if you're quoting Eliphaz to prove a theological point, what you're probably doing is showing that your point is bad. Right? So don't use Eliphaz to positively prove something because it means that you're wrong. So Eliphaz is just going to say, you don't even fear God, Job, and that's why these bad things are happening to you. But the reason why you don't fear God is because nobody does, and everybody does terrible things all the time. And the fact that everybody just isn't obliterated and turned into space dust is a sign that God is gracious. Now, is there a sense in which he's right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You could look at it in that way, kind of.
Yeah, but we are also made in God's image, and we also know how to choose the good and the evil. And there are also lots of times that people do choose good. And so we are not completely and totally depraved. We are not inherently evil. We are not so far gone that there is no goodness in humans, right? Because we are made in God's image. Are we imperfect? Yes. Are we striving to be like God who is perfect? Yes. And when you are imperfect, striving for perfection, you're going to fall short. But to say that there is no goodness in humans whatsoever is just not a true statement. Right? It is not an accurate way to look at who people are made in God's image. Right? And now we're not talking about justification here. We're just talking about the nature of humanity. Okay? All right, so anything else you noticed in chapter 15?
Nope. But Eliphaz does seem pretty pessimistic towards humankind, I suppose.
Yes, he is. Eliphaz is even going to argue that, the verses 17 down through 35, that Job's punishment is just because he did something to deserve it. And that's where we're going to get to Job chapter 16, where Job is again, now he's replying to Eliphaz. And in these sections that we've read, is it chapter 10? Or is it, let me see, did I put it in my notes? In chapter 13, Job is going to say, you're miserable physicians. And now here in chapter 16 and verse 2, miserable comforters are you all. I've heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you. In other words, you're not helping me. You're not healing me. You're not helping me. You should probably just leave. Right? And so we need to think about our role. When something happens, we should be healing or helping. And these friends are doing neither. So Job is going to say in this chapter, in chapter 16, that there is no comfort in wisdom, in words, or life. Right? He has found no comfort in any of those things.
I didn't find much comfort in their words either, to be fair.
That's true, right? And if your only options are Job's view or the friend's view, there's no comfort in either view. Right? And that's what Job is struggling with through this, is the friends are saying, because nothing bad has happened to them. And so it's easy to say when your life is going, well, if you would just be like me, everything would be okay. Failing to recognize that your life isn't okay because you've done everything right. It's easy to point the finger at somebody and say, well, your life is wrong because you're bad. And when you look at the two sides of that discussion, there's no hope in either one.
Because you can't hope to ever be perfect, and therefore your life will be terrible. And it's no fun to know that you're right if your life is still terrible.
Right.
So either way, you're still going to have an awful existence, I suppose.
Right. And when you look at life under the sun and the vanity of it all, the repetition of it, how the laundry never gets done, there's always dishes to do, right? There's always fields to plow, there's always things to harvest, there's always stuff to do until you get old or get sick and die. right? And so Ecclesiastes deals with some of these same questions. Where is your hope? In what do you place your hope? Well, that question in chapter 14 is one of the big questions, is shall a man die and live again? If the answer is yes, then that's where our hope is. Right? And Job is going to say later, I know that my Redeemer lives. So if there is a Redeemer, then there is hope. But we have to look outside of ourselves for that hope. And so that's one of the things that the book of Job is trying to teach us, is that to find the hope of humanity, we have to look outside ourselves. All right, you got any closing thoughts?
Not yet. Not today.
Okay. Yeah, you covered a lot. You did a good job. All right, well, we'll go ahead and end there. We went a little long, but we covered 2 days' worth. We're trying to keep it to 20 minutes, so 15, 20 minutes. We went about 10 minutes over today. But we're going to do a better job of staying on top of it through the rest of the year, I hope. All right, thanks for joining us. God bless you. We love you all, and we'll be back again.